Welcome to Cures and Capital, the podcast on value creation in biotech and pharma. I am Simon.
I'm Martin.
And today we are talking to an exciting guest, one not afraid of speaking his mind, Kelvin Stott. So Kelvin brings 20 years of diverse leadership experience from pharma R&D and operations, drug discovery, drug development and portfolio management, strategy consulting, biotech startups and venture capital. So this is another very well-versed expert that has experience from across the industry. Kelvin is currently the CEO of Amporin Pharmaceuticals. So Martin, what can our listeners look forward to in this episode?
We are going to be discussing many different topics, and we will start broadly. We will start talking about the declining ROI on drug R&D. Then we will discuss why might the current pharma's business model be broken and how could it be fixed. We will also talk about better R&D portfolio decision-making. How can we raise the bar in pharma innovation? And we will discuss also the topic of value of information. And how can we do bolder decisions and smarter risk-taking?
Yeah, and after the interview with Kelvin, Martin and I will, as usual, go over our reflections and takeaways. And as always, all views and opinions expressed in the podcast are our own and do not represent that of our employers.
And now please welcome Kelvin Stott.
Kelvin Stott, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Really looking forward to this.
So maybe just to get us started, you could speak a little bit to your bio.
Sure. I'm a scientist by training, so I did a PhD in biomolecular engineering at Cambridge, where I was also a research fellow. And since then, I've worked in different areas of the industry, including biotech startups, venture capital, consulting, and also in pharma, mostly in strategic functions such as performance management and R&D portfolio management.
Mm-hmm. So I think here you bring the whole nuance of expertise to the table. So venture capital, big pharma, biotech, consulting. And let's get straight to it. And as we discussed a little bit before, that you come across as someone who says what he thinks. And for people not familiar with some of your work, let me just read the titles of your blog posts that you put out a couple of years back. So the first was Pharma's Broken Business Model, Part 1, and Industry on the Brink of Terminal Decline. And then Part 2, Scraping the Barrel in Drug Discovery. So what motivated you to get this work out there?
Yeah, I mean, working in R&D and pharma for so many years, you read, a lot of reports and blogs and hear a lot of opinions on R&D productivity. This is something which has been discussed around the industry as being critical for many years now. And I always felt that, different people were picking different causes or, superficial things like higher regulatory hurdles or the low-hanging fruit is being picked. And to me, I felt there was truth in all of these things, and there was some kind of underlying binding theme or principle that kind of explained all of this. And I was, heavily motivated to look into that and to understand the problem. I guess the nature of, my nature being a kind of curious scientist. But also I had a very clear idea that this is really critical because pharma's entire business model really depends on generating value through R&D and innovation and feeding the returns for that back into investing into the industry. And unless we tackle that, the industry could be dead. So I wanted to get a real understanding of what the causes are and what the implications are.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense.
For our listeners that didn't necessarily read all the articles and analysis you have done, could you walk us through a little bit or guide us through how you approached the analysis and what were the conclusions?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of detailed bottom-up kind of analysis. I mean, the likes of Deloitte do a fantastic job kind of building a bottom-up model of what's been invested in particular projects and what the returns of that might be on specific products. But there's always a lot of criticism about this bottom-up model. It can be very detailed and complex and full of assumptions as well. And so I tried to take a different angle to look at the industry as a whole and build a kind of top-down model. And if you look at the industry as a whole and its business model, ultimately you've got investments into R&D on an ongoing basis, and you've got returns which come out ultimately as profits of the company. So this is widely available information, And as long as you understand the model and the impact of time periods of investing into R&D, you can kind of extract a return on investment type parameter, looking at very high level, publicly available information that spans the entire industry. So that's the approach I took. So very little left to imagination or assumptions, just by looking at the trends in revenues of the industry, in the profits of the industry, and in the R&D costs of the industry. You can get a good picture of the trends in the return on investment that's driving all of that, at least over a significant time period.
And could you maybe walk our listeners through what were your conclusions in that analysis? So you have done all this work to put it together, and what did you come out with, and what did it show you?
Well, I mean, the first thing was seeing a very long-term and steady downward trend. So I guess this wasn't really new to it, in a sense that it reiterated and reinforced what a lot of people have been feeling, or coming up with different ways of analysis, more rudimentary ways of measuring return on investment, such as NMEs per dollar, R&D spend. And so to calculate an ROI, or return on investment, or internal rate of return from all of this, it pretty much aligned with the long-term downward trend. And the deeper analysis was also thinking about that trend is going through all of these changes that we've seen in the industry, the advent of technologies, combinatorial chemistry, high throughput gene sequencing, and pretty much all of these at the time were purported to be game changers, things that would transform R&D productivity, increase the efficiency of innovation. And yet we've seen this downward trend despite all of these advances. And the big question is why? And I like to look for parallels in, other areas where you see a similar kind of fundamental trend. And it reminded me a lot of the oil industry, where you've effectively got a limited resource, i.e. oil. And in the early days, it's easy to stick your finger in the sand and oil gushes out in huge quantity, great quality, etc., without any expense or risk. But as you exploit that resource, it's gone, it's commoditized, it's used up. So you have to dig deeper at greater cost, take bigger risks, and you get this diminishing returns, a similar kind of trend. And I saw great parallels between mining or drilling for oil and looking for opportunities which haven't yet been exploited in drug discovery.
I think it's a great analogy. I think you also very nicely described it in a way that it's also a direct result of how we prioritize the investments, right? So of course we go after the best things first, and then what you are kind of left with is the worse and worse things over time.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it really says we've been doing a great job. The fact that return on investment is decreasing means that we've done a great job in terms of prioritizing those that make a difference. Because as long as if your business model is restricted to a limited scope of opportunities in terms of the targets we go for or the modalities we use to go after those targets, still the scope of that is fairly limited. And as long as we're trying to choose which are the best opportunities to derive the biggest return on investment, by definition, later on, we're left to look for more incremental innovations with a lower return on investment and effectively milking the cow. And you will naturally see a diminishing return on investment. So it's actually an indicator that we've done our job well and as an industry and really gone for the best returns earlier on. But there's only, of course, so long you can go on doing that before it doesn't make any sense to continue with the same business model. Similar way is there will always be oil left in the ground, but at some point, it will cost more energy, more oil in terms of energy to dig the remaining oil out of the ground, that it doesn't make sense to keep digging.
Yes.
Yet there will still always be oil in the ground.
Yeah, but it will be harder to find it. I fully agree. But I wonder now, how are your analysis received by the industry? I mean, you essentially told the industry is not going well and it might actually go worse. How was it received?
It was supposed to be a big wake-up call anyway, shake the tree and give a stark outlook, because, you can look back and look at the trend, but the key part of the message was, look, it's almost like global warming. If we continue on this trend, these are the consequences. So the whole point of that was to stimulate a bit of shock, a bit of debate, and really a realization that we have to do something fundamentally different, not just keep chasing after new targets or whatever with the same modalities, but the industry itself, our business model will need to evolve. And I think the overall response, I have to say, was pretty much almost overwhelmingly positive. A few people with vested interests didn't like to hear the message, but look, you said at the beginning, I'm someone who says what I think, and I think it's important to have the debate and not to bury our head in the sand, a bit like climate change, and really get to the truth.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big theme in terms of the way I think. It's really about truth seeking, because you can only make decisions and change things for the better if you're aware of what needs to be changed. But overall, very positive response.
Okay, but that's good to hear. I was actually wondering if there was a lot of disagreement, but a positive response is a good response.
Well, disagreement is a good thing as well, because that's part of the debate.
That's true. I fully agree. And part of your analysis, or your analysis kind of pointed in the direction that the rate of return on investment on innovation, as measured by IRR, or internal rate of return, would approach zero by 2020. And to make sure that we ground the listeners to what does that mean, could you first explain what does an IRR of 0% mean?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, there are many ways to measure, productivity. For example, number of drugs produced versus investment. But financial measures, purely financial measures, are take into account the quality of the drugs you produce and the value of the drugs you produce, etc. So that it's financial measures of productivity, like return on investment, are more holistic ways of doing this that take into account all the factors. Now, IRR, internal rate of return, the technical definition is when the expected net present value of a project or a portfolio is at what discount rate will give you a value of zero, expected net present value of zero. Now, that doesn't really mean much, but the way to think of IRR is like an effective interest rate if you were investing your money had it in a bank account with a compound interest rate. So an IRR of 0% effectively means a compound interest rate of 0%, which is pretty much like keeping your money under the mattress. It's delivering no return, it's not destroying value, but on average, that's where the industry was heading to. 0% IRR is also the boundary between investment and gambling, where with investments, you have a positive expected return, whereas with gambling, you have a negative expected return, but you're hoping with luck for a positive return.
I have to say that just on my end, I used to always use the definition that IRR is the discount rate that puts your net present value to zero. But then I read your paper and you said it's basically like an effective interest rate. And I think it's a very nice way to say to someone who maybe doesn't have a financial background. It's essentially the interest rate you are going to receive on your investment. But now I wonder, so now we are after 2020, we're in 2025. To what extent did your prediction of getting to 0% by 2020 came true?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, this was if you extrapolate a line, this was a point estimate in 2020, and there was always going to be some uncertainty around that. Now, of course, we've had COVID, which had a huge impact with suddenly a new opportunity, actually, for many companies to develop new products, which have been very successful. So there was actually big, well, I say big in the context of the long-term downward trend. It's still quite a small uptick, but it showed some promise for a while. Now, as far as I'm aware, I haven't gone back and redone all this analysis, but as far as I'm aware, that the uptick didn't last for long, and it's come back down. But there is some indications that it's plateaued a little bit, so it's still, even now, barely above 0%, but just barely, certainly not in a healthy way, and probably below at least below the discount rate or the cost of capital.
And just to give you due credit, I looked at the reports from Deloitte after that period of time. And I mean, even though it didn't get to zero, it was very, very close, as you say. I mean, we barely just didn't touch the zero line.
Yeah, either way, it's not a healthy number, whether it's 0% or 1 or 2%. That is not a good rate of return for such a high risk industry.
No, I fully agree. I mean, being even just below the cost of capital, it's never good. You have offered in your analysis several possibilities for the industry to break the trend of the declining ROI on innovation, from big paradigm shifts that can reshape the entire industry to how we pick our drug targets. Can you explain this a little bit?
Yeah, I think it's about, as an industry, we need to think big and bold, and not just big and bold in terms of trying new targets, because frankly, a lot of the targets we've either looked at, already dismissed, or tried and they failed, or there's already too many companies chasing the few targets that we do believe in that are left and haven't already been exploited. Now, I think what we need to do as an industry is think about reinventing the R&D model itself, to open up completely new fields that we haven't simply been able to target with the existing modalities that we've had up till now, small molecules and antibodies and biologics and so on. These are limited to what they can do in terms of, small molecules can only have a certain exposure to a target and specificity. They're not very good at inhibiting protein interactions. Antibodies and biologics aren't very good at getting into certain tissues and into certain cells. So there are limits with every modality, and each modality has its own limits, but also its own opportunities. And more, the industry has been moving into cell and gene therapies, and this is a very exciting area, but it too will have its limits. And ultimately, tissue regeneration could be a big area that will have opportunities, but again, have its limits. If you look back at the industry, I mean, pharma industry didn't exist forever. It existed initially in terms of bulk chemicals. And the companies that made those bulk chemicals made huge margins because no one else could make them. But once the patents expire, these technologies become commoditized. So what did those companies do? They started looking at specialty chemicals, dyes in the textile industry, etc., which had a bigger margin and could be protected because of their specialty. But these too became commoditized. After a while, certain companies recognized that some of these textile dyes had antibiotic effects, which again created a new margin, a new opportunity. So pharma has evolved from bulk chemicals through specialty chemicals through to small molecule active drugs, and even then on into more complex biologics, antibodies and such like, and now it's transitioning even further in complexity of solutions into cell and gene therapies. And the ultimate, in my mind, are things like tissue engineering, where you're looking at growing organs on a chip and looking at whole tissues rather than therapies at the cell level or at the gene level or at the molecular level. So I think there's still room for pharma to keep on evolving. Whether or not it's still called pharma or biopharma or will be known by a completely different name as an industry, I don't know. But pharma as it stands can't continue extracting value from a limited business model.
And I think now you kind of touched upon the next question I have, but I'll try anyway. What do you see as the most promising avenue for addressing the industry's declining ROI? I'll now connect it to a little bit what you said. Would it be this venturing out into new modalities and technologies?
I believe so, but new models based on not just new modalities, but new models. Yeah, that's pretty much it. And technologies that are not just, iterations of the same kind of things that we've done.
And when you say models, you mean disease models, I assume, or?
Oh, there's a whole area of disease models. I mean, the predictability of preclinical and disease models is another whole question to address. But yeah, any improvements in there that can weed out early stage failures better and more reliably will certainly have a big impact. But I'm talking more about the business models themselves itself. How R&D is segmented, how pharma companies does it make sense anymore to have fully integrated pharma companies, or should there be more a dynamic environment where the early stage is all done by biotechs and evolving rapidly, almost like bacteria, whereas the pharma companies focus much more or even exclusively on, from phase 2 onwards. These are questions I don't have answers to, but I think we do need to think radically about the business model of pharma as well as the technologies behind the R&D and the modalities.
I think we see, some of the big consultancies out there, their various insights and reports they put out, they all start pointing more and more towards business model review. So it's like we've come to the end of the road somehow, that now it's maybe not how we assess drug targets, but it's maybe more a review of the overall business model. But that's a big one, as you hint at, Kelvin.
The good thing is the industry won't die out. It will evolve, but there will be victims or those that don't survive on the way as part of that natural selection process, companies that come and go.
In terms of prognosis, so you gave a prognosis for 2020, but now I wonder, now that you don't have to do it as specifically as it was before, but if we look toward the future, what do you see in the next 10 years in terms of either R&D productivity or return on investment? Do you see a bright future, or do you see continuation?
I do. The blog articles kind of gave a stark picture, but it hinted at the end towards some optimism. And really the answer to that optimism is through the evolution of the industry. I think by getting this, message out that the industry itself has to adapt or it will die, is hopefully it's helping to, get people to think along these lines and try some bold new ways of doing things that will hopefully find an avenue, a way forward for the industry to evolve into. But I'm pretty optimistic overall for where the industry will be, even though I think it will look very different to how it looks at the moment.
But that's very fair. That's a very good answer. But now I'll leave it up to you, Simon. Now we go to the next section.
Yeah, so let's shift our conversation to R&D portfolio strategy. I know that's one of your areas of a lot of interest over many years, Kelvin, and also decision making, and also how do we create value in our pipelines today. But maybe before we go into sort of the toolkit of what is available and how should we do it, I would like to ask you about how do you see, if you go into a typical pharma company today and look at their culture for doing innovation and for doing decision making, what is your take on that?
I think there's a lot of inertia, always within a big company to how things are done, and also there's a lot baked into all of that. There's a lot of human nature, cognitive biases, which are very difficult to be consciously aware of. We talk about survivorship bias or confirmation bias. I think there are about 50 different biases that have been recognized, and I think not just big companies, small companies, we're all human. We struggle with these biases in R&D, and that's probably the biggest challenge internally, is dealing with those and being as objective as possible based on data. Given that there's very limited data, we're breaking new ground. So to me, that's a big factor, and part of the culture is, I think, driven by the way as a business, we define success as getting new products out. But we're a science-based business or industry, and success is defined differently. Success is basically defined in terms of learning or finding the truth. And there's an inherent conflict between defining, and this happens right in R&D, where, from a business angle, you're trying to progress and advance projects through in line with the business objectives or definition of success, almost against the scientific definition of success, which is based on finding the truth of whether a molecule actually can work or not. And this is one big source of bias that I think affects all decision making at project level, at portfolio, at executive board level. And we need to be most aware of that bias. And if it was up to me, I would, make sure that as a business, we're very much defining success in terms of truth, because anyway, the truth will always come out. There's no good burning money pushing a project forward through early development on the basis that it is a positive result if it's not a true result, because ultimately that project will fail at much greater cost, or even worse, it will get approved and then either cause damage to patients or not make the commercial returns that it should do in order to recoup its own investment and then some.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And maybe a more philosophical question. So what is good portfolio management to you? I know you have worked in portfolio management functions in really big companies. So what are the essentials of good portfolio management?
I believe it's bringing different perspectives from across different parts of the company, the industry, the outside view, the inside view, the commercial angle, the scientific angle, the financial angle, in bringing all these elements together to create a clear story about where the portfolio is, where it needs to go, how the opportunities and projects stack up against each other. So to me, it's really about shining a mirror, a very objective picture of where the portfolio is and where it can or should go back to the organization, and facilitating a great discussion. Now, sometimes I hear, people say portfolio management is really about, the strategic decisions and so on. Yes, I think indirectly, but portfolio functions don't make the decisions. These should be higher up in the board and normally are. So in that sense, good portfolio management is working as a partner with the different project teams, stakeholders, to gather the most reliable information, to challenge that information, and to distill all that up into supporting strategic decisions at the high level, and through facilitating a good discussion.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And what is your take on then financial valuation modeling to enrich the discussion you described there? So what about early stage versus late stage assets? And when would you start applying a quantitative financial valuation to the assets?
Yeah, quantitative and qualitative valuations are both really important, because they engage different parts of the brain. Qualitative assessments, where you usually involve some kind of scorecard on different metrics, strength of evidence, unmet patient need, that you can't easily put numbers behind. That's one important thing that should always be taken into account throughout the pipeline, because it's based largely on experience, gut feeling, etc. And everyone has an opinion, right? And it's an important thing to take into account. It needs to be challenged, the views for cognitive biases, etc. Now, the other side is also really important, as you say, is the quantitative modeling, where you can actually put numbers behind an ROI-based kind of model. For example, look at projected revenue forecasts, cash flow, expenses, costs, and all of that. And that is really, really critical late stage, because you're talking big bucks, from phase 2 onwards, and the decision to go into phase 3. There's no excuse not to do that at that stage. Now, different people will give different opinions, I think, on how early do you go with your financial modeling. Do you go into as far early as preclinical, or even, lead optimization, for example? I would say until you get into preclinical, until you've got a clear candidate, there's probably not much use or benefit, because it's so far ahead. These forecasts, there's so much uncertainty in any numbers you do. Better to rely almost entirely on the qualitative assessment. But I think once you start putting decent investment in, even from preclinical, I think it's still worth doing a financial model, as long as you keep into account that many of the numbers, the assumptions you put in, have a huge plus or minus range of uncertainty around them. And the important thing is to play with the model and to look at sensitivity analysis and figure out through that, where are our biggest source of uncertainty? Is it really in the technical side, in the R&D? Because in many cases, I think we also have huge uncertainty in the market, and all of this information is useful to help pin down an understanding of value creation. That's what the modeling is really for. And actually, sometimes you do the modeling, it might tell you we're better off because it's cheaper to get information on the market assessment than it is to do a preclinical trial or a phase 1 trial. If we can just get more certainty for very cheap on our market, we could already perhaps eliminate whether this project is viable or not before even doing any R&D. So it's worth thinking about these and running financial models to test the hypothesis of creating a return on investment as early as possible, and also bring in the commercial people as early as possible to understand what is it we're really what does success look like in terms of a product and how that will be adopted in the market.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And also you describe, Kelvin, here sort of the role of portfolio management functions in helping to inform and enrich discussions for decision makers. So what do you see, and you've seen it from the inside, what do you think portfolio teams struggle with the most having this role?
I think, I've been quite fortunate in that respect because I've been conscious of this potential issue and it's really critical, and I've been able to deal with it. It's so important for portfolio teams to be seen not as kind of the bad cops and as the stage gates, is giving permission about whether a project can go ahead or not. So having that understanding and appreciation of what portfolio function is for. It's not there to be the decision maker. It's not there to be the champion of one project or another, or not of a project. It is looking at the holistic picture of the portfolio for the benefit of the company as a whole, being as objective as possible, taking into account as much of the information as possible, listening to all of the opinions, etc., building those in. So I think that's the biggest challenge. It's for project teams who are naturally champions of their own individual projects to appreciate the value of having a holistic picture of the portfolio as a whole, and an understanding of how and where and if their project really fits into that alongside other projects, because they don't see as much depth on the other projects as they see in their own project.
No, I think that sounds very familiar. I was thinking maybe one quick question also on your own decision-making style. So where are you on the spectrum from pure analysis to pure gut feeling? And some would call gut feeling pattern recognition, but can you place yourself on that spectrum?
Yeah, I think I already gave some hint to that in terms of it's really important to balance the left and right brain thinking. Not just to be blind to people's gut feeling and opinions, but and focus on the data, but likewise not to just rely on intuition. I tend to start with a hypothesis and a feeling about where potential issues are, what's important and what's not, but ultimately then test the hypothesis with data and facts, and where there's uncertainty, try to build those in with more analytical modeling and so on. So I tend to be hypothesis driven. Maybe that's coming from the scientific background, but ultimately convinced by the data and the analysis.
No, that makes sense. We also discussed a little bit before, and there was some topic in terms of decision science, decision analysis that you brought up that maybe not so many people bring up, and that's this value of information, or VOI, and how that can be deployed in our decision making. Could you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, value of information is a topic that I've heard very few, if any, people talk about in the industry, and it's a really interesting concept. Generally in the industry, when we talk about value creation or try to measure value or return on investment, we're looking at metrics like expected net present value, which is, probabilized discounted cash flows and so on. The problem with ENPV is I mean, there are many problems with the assumptions, etc., but that even conceptually, it's a measure of how much value we expect to create through a different project. But as such, a project is a project and it's a fungible asset. And so once a project by its design has a certain expectation of creating value, that expected value is effectively the basis for the value of the project as it stands. And of course, that project could be out-licensed, it could be divested to another buyer. So why does that make sense? Why does ENPV make sense to prioritize what projects we keep going internally versus divesting? It shouldn't have any impact. So the concept of value of information is really interesting because what it tells you, it asks the question, how much would you be prepared to pay to know the outcome of a specific trial or experiment before you actually invest in that trial or experiment? What is the value that we create with a certain trial or phase or experiment in terms of the information, whether or not it's a positive or negative result? And it's a really interesting thing because unlike ENPV, which is holistic across the entire lifetime of the project, value of information is specific to each individual experiment or phase. So we can break down the value creation of a project in terms of the sequence of experiments or phases that we do and the questions on which they're based. We can prioritize projects not just in terms of their overall lifetime expectation of creating value, the ENPV, but we can prioritize them in terms of which projects are asking the most critical value adding questions early on. And that's how we can create value in the short term compared with the cost of investing in those experiments, and prioritize them over projects where we are maybe asking questions where we mostly already know the answer to. There's no point doing a trial if we know it's going to fail, but equally, there's no point doing a trial or experiment if we know it's going to succeed because it's not telling us anything new. So this is a really key concept to I think the industry should start thinking about is the value of information it generates through each successive part of its development plans.
And do you have any practical advice for how to implement that? Is there any, do you use a specific template, a specific way of talking about it, or is it just something we need to get used to working with?
Yeah, I think actually if you do an ENPV model anyway, you've got all the forecasts, the cost assumptions, etc., that drive ENPV are the same parameters that drive value of information through each phase. There's just a particular specific formula that you can derive from the assumptions you already have and extract from the same models. So technically, as long as a company is doing ENPV calculations, it can also examine value of information and return on the value of information for each phase of its projects. So technically, it's very easy. It's just about adding another little bit to its existing models. The challenge is the education part and having an organization understand in a truth versus progress seeking culture, value of information is a really critical component of the process of creating value. It's almost like a derivative of ENPV in the same way that derivatives and shares and share options, etc. Share options are derivative of shares themselves.
And I think my next question is around this, the value of information, and we already started connecting it a little bit to the probability of success for the various stages. And you said the probability of success should not be too low, then it's maybe too stupid to go ahead with that experiment or the trial. It shouldn't be too high because then we are asking too little. So if I understood you correctly when we spoke before, that around a 50% probability of success, that maximizes the value extraction of the experiments. Is that correctly understood?
Yeah, pretty much. So regardless of the overall probability of success of a project from where it is to launch, That depends on, where it is in the process through phase 2, etc. The earlier you are, generally, the lower the probability. But any particular experiment or trial that you run, ideally, that should be as close to 50% success to pass through to the next phase as possible. And the reason for the 50% is it represents maximum uncertainty. It means, by definition, you're asking a question that you have no clue either way whether it will succeed or fail. And I think, as I mentioned briefly before, if you're running a trial or an experiment where the success in that phase is 100%, that may sound great, but all you're doing is asking a question you already know the answer to and paying for that question to be answered. What's the point? What's the value creation in doing that? And also, likewise, if you know it's going to fail 0%, obviously you wouldn't go ahead. It's going to fail. But 50% mathematically is the sweet spot in asking a question that you really have no idea, but it's critical to proceed.
Yeah, and I know, but also maybe what would be your advice? I don't know, maybe to governance or to an asset team meeting, and the team brings a 50% probability of success. Maybe governance expects maybe to see something that's closer to 100. So how do we work with this?
Yeah, I wouldn't get too, although it's a mathematical concept, I really, as soon as people start, saying, well, this is only 40% or 50%, I think there we need to be careful in project and portfolio teams to get too buried down into the detail. And it's a false kind of way of asking this. I think conceptually it's really stepping back, then tapping more into the intuitive side and say, do we feel more confident or less confident that something will succeed in this particular phase? And if we're roughly ambivalent and we have no clue, that's a good sign. So rather than whether it's 50, 40 or 35 or whatever, I think the risk is that it just becomes a numbers game and people try to explain the numbers to fit a narrative rather than doing a kind of consensus gut feel check. Do we feel that this is roughly 50-50 chance of success?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So now we've discussed your original industry analysis, the broader picture of decision making, and today you are CEO of Amporin Pharma. So how has that changed your view on, or maybe practice around some of these themes now that you are kind of sitting very close to the R&D engine room?
I would actually say it's been the other way around. It's thanks to my experience and long years in portfolio management. Considering things like truth seeking, how we define success in terms of a true result, whether or not it's positive or negative, rather than a positive result, whether or not it's true or false. So I think it's the other way around. I've brought my thinking and learnings from the portfolio side into this new startup, and a big part of the philosophy that we're following is that this is either going to work or not. At least we're doing something very different. And as long as we design a path forward to test the hypothesis, can this really work as we think it could, as quickly as possible, as cheaply as possible? And look, if it doesn't, there's plenty of other ideas and projects. But that's probably, as I say, taking what I've learned, the philosophy from my past into this new startup. And hopefully, I think that's why we're either going to be incredibly successful or fail, but at least not, burn too much cash and take too much of our time in our lives doing it.
No, very nice answer. So if you were to give a piece of advice for R&D leaders out there in pharma today, what would it be?
Think big and bold, be different, almost just for the sake of it. Try very diverse projects. Companies talk about diversity and inclusion, but often on a superficial basis. Diversity is incredibly important for trying new models, for trying new approaches. for an industry that has to adapt or survive, you need that diversity in the business model gene pool. So think big, aim high, think different, and aim for truth and fail fast.
Just adding on top of Simon's question, what would be your advice to the finance leaders? Would it be the same?
Depends if you mean external finance, like analysts.
For the CFOs and the people in the finance part of the organization.
Yeah, I mean, it depends how senior. The CFO should probably be involved in the portfolio decisions themselves, but the finance functions, they are also like the portfolio teams, supporting the processing of information and working together in order to facilitate and support good decisions, including financial analysis, including the scientific aspects, the commercial forecasts, etc. It's a big sharing of information. What I would say about financial forecasts in general is it's really important to think of them as probability distributions rather than as point estimates, because what we definitely know about any forecast is it's precisely wrong, especially in sales where there's been a plus or minus 100% error in the sales forecasts of projects. So I think a big transition in mentality within finance in the pharma industry is to think more in terms of probability distributions around forecasts rather than point estimates. It's similar to how classical physics, Newtonian mechanics, used to think of mechanics in terms of very definite, discrete outcomes based on cause effect, Newton's laws of mechanics. And the transition we had in physics in going into quantum mechanics, where suddenly everything is based on a probability distribution. There are no certainties. And in a similar way, I think finance could have that transition in thinking from almost Newtonian mechanics into a more quantum world without making it overcomplicated, where we're thinking of everything in terms of some kind of probability distribution around an expectation. That's probably a useful way of looking at it.
Fully agree.
I think you're almost about to give a piece of advice maybe for the investment analysts out there. I don't know if you had something burning to say, but then there's an opportunity.
I would say look for the companies that have the philosophy of truth-seeking and thinking bold and failing fast. I think in the industry there's a tendency to try and sell stories and fill pipelines for short-term gains and things that look like it creates value. But if you've got a management team, a CXO team that is really trying bold things and failing fast and truth-seeking and comes across as truth-seeking, it's probably a better return on investment ultimately for an investor.
Yeah. Do you think it's easy for investment bankers actually to support that kind of narrative as it looks today, where you maybe look forward to the next quarterly earnings call? Or
probably not. Yeah, I mean, I can't say too much more about the analysts that are out there. I know they look at only the late stage assets and try and assign some probabilities around it because they are, it is quite a short term game or thinking, and maybe there's a gap in the market for analysts to give a view which is much more longer term and almost philosophical. But I don't think many analysts actually do that at the moment.
It almost feels like the industry is being looked at through the short-term lens, even though the entire business is trying to create long-term value.
Yeah, very, very much so.
So now we are getting towards the end. Is there something that you feel like we didn't discuss, but it's important to add into the conversation?
It's been a great conversation. I think we covered so much. Yeah, nothing comes to mind. I think we've covered everything. I'll probably think of something like after this ends, you know how it is, but maybe that would just risk diluting some of the messages that we've already covered. So I think it's probably good to leave it on the key topics and messages that we have covered.
But then I wonder, what is going to be your focus now in 2025? Are you going to do any further analysis or fundraising?
Well, this podcast probably represents still the tail end of a career that has been in portfolio management. Now I'm really excited with Amporin and hands on and trying something really big and bold to tackle these neurodegenerative diseases with a completely new mechanism. So my focus this year and hopefully beyond is very much on pushing that as far as it makes sense to do so. And fundraising is a big part of that this year.
That's a great purpose for the year. Of course, we will link to all your work or all the work we have been mentioning here on our LinkedIn group, the Cures and Capital. But where can our listeners go follow up with you if they want to get in touch?
Oh, I'm very active on LinkedIn. So best thing is just to connect on LinkedIn, send a message. I'm not the fastest to respond on LinkedIn, but I do, always look through the invites to connect. And of course, if there's a specific question or point, just to pique my interest in the connection request, that helps. So I know it's not just a kind of generic connection.
That's great, Kelvin. Thank you very much for the conversation.
Thank you very much, Kelvin.
You're welcome, and thank you so much. Great topic, great blog, and a really important movement.
So, Martin, that was a really interesting conversation with Kelvin Stott. I really enjoyed it, but what did you take away?
The first thing I took away that was the most obvious. Now we had a second person describing essentially the same problem, no matter how we measure it, whether it's Jack Scannell measuring productivity, or it's Kelvin Stott measuring return on investment. No matter how it's sliced and diced or measured or what goes in, the trend is the same. It's declining, and it's declining rapidly. It almost doesn't matter what kind of technological breakthrough there was along the way. It goes down despite it. And I think it points that, yes, we have a problem, but there are also some potential solutions. Any of the solutions might not be the thing that will turn it away, but there are at least some things we can definitely do. And before I will throw it back to you, Simon, I just want to mention one thing that he nicely put in, at least that's something that stayed in my mind, is that the IRR of getting close to zero, which is where we are heading, also puts us close to the territory of gambling. And I think that nicely ties to the topic of portfolio management, that of course, if we keep doing bad decisions, we shouldn't be surprised that we are basically gambling with our investments in the pharma industry, which definitely links to how can we do better decisions?
Yeah, definitely. And I think decision-making is one of the operationally addressable factors. Maybe also a little bit of pessimist saying they will probably not rescue a broken business model in pharma if that's the case. But I think decision-making is something we can address for sure. And I was happy to hear him bring the cross-functional view to the table around portfolio decision-making. That is not only an R&D event when we make decisions in the portfolio, and it's not only a finance event. So we need finance, R&D, commercial, everyone around the table. I think that will help us, but how much, I don't know. It's not like it will get the return on investment to 50% just by looking at your decision making, but it's a start for sure. And then we spoke around the value of information, also how we can rationally dissect our decision making and investment decisions around our assets. So even if our ENPV is under pressure on the portfolio and asset level, let's try to break the individual steps down so it's manageable and we can maximize the value of the information that we can extract from the individual experiments. I think that's good practical advice. Exactly how we would implement it, I think that requires a little bit of thinking, but I think it's good approach and philosophy for a start. And Kelvin, he's clearly a bold and courageous in his way of thinking about decision making. Also this pushing the envelope, raising the innovation bar. If your probability of success for your next experiment is almost 100% or above 80 or whatever where we should put the threshold, then it tells you that you are not asking good enough questions. You're not getting your hard questions answered. So push the envelope, raise the bar, and bring the probability of success down in the process. If there's willingness in the meeting rooms across the industry, I don't know, but it's I think it's a good and healthy advice. What are your reflections on these
I think a little bit after we had time to reflect on the interview with Kelvin, but also now that you are talking about it, actually one thing that clicked is I recently read a book about venture capital thinking and decision making. And now that I listen to how you are describing or interpreting this value of information, and when I also remember back to how Kelvin was describing this mental framework of course, you don't want your probability of success too high because then you are not really doing any innovation, but you don't want it too low because then, I mean, why would you do it if you know it's going to fail? And now I link it back to the book on venture capital thinking, where they also try to essentially, like pharma companies, they have a portfolio of bets and they need to play. They know a lot of them will fail, like in the pharma business. They know there'll be 80-90% failure. And then some of those that make it, they don't really make it big. And they kind of really have to play it for those bets that make it so big, they will outweigh all the other investments. And it kind of, when I imagine now this discussion, I kind of think about it the same way. If you start to go for investments that all have 90% probability of success, yes, you will push a lot of things out. But because of the risk of attrition in your portfolio and so on, they will not be good enough to pay off for all the failures. And then you continue declining your return on investment.
Yeah, no, and I think one example often discussed in the industry is Novartis, where they have this peculiar R&D productivity problem, where they've actually been very innovative, and the number of drugs they've pushed out of their pipeline is very impressive. But even their CEO has said many times that the value per asset, the peak sales per asset, is not matching what they need to be in the business they want to be in. So yeah, it's a hard one, and there's a lot to think about. And I promised you before we would sit down and do the outro here that I'll try to be optimistic and positive. But I'm really making an effort, because I also think it's a super tough problem we are tackling. I know we're only a couple of episodes into the episode here, but we're talking about potentially a broken business model for the industry. And right now I cannot see how to fix it. So I'm also I'm happy that we'll have more episodes to explore more practical solutions as we have promised our listeners, but it requires a lot of hard thinking by many people.
But I think it's also fair, as you mentioned, now we are early on in the guest list of episodes. Now we are just pointing to how big the problem is. It also points to the severity of kind of solutions we need to look for. So I wouldn't be surprised, and if some of the episodes we will need to explore is how can we potentially change the business model of the pharma and biotech companies? How can we really look for the breakthrough innovation? How can we really look for the breakthrough changes that are really needed to change this severely declining and long-term declining trend? It's not going to be small things.
Yeah.
And I completely agree with you. I think after this interview, I find it hard to see how any small thing can really change it. But I think it's also this exciting area where we really need to find something big. And if we do, then we might actually create more value.
Yeah, I agree. And now we have Jack Scannell, and the listeners can check out that episode. We have Kelvin Stott, and they point towards something we can do today. Think about your competitive environment, where you decide to play in your portfolio, how you do decision making, how you look at your drug targets. But those step change in R&D productivity, return on investment, that will move the needle an order of magnitude. I think those will come later in the season.
Yes, and when I remember the discussion with Jack Scannell now, I don't know if it was during the interview or around it, he gave this great analogy that I think greatly summarizes what we want to achieve with this podcast, at least in my mind. And that is that whoever you speak to from across the industry, from different sides, they will have their different point of view, depending on where they're coming from. And he had this analogy that we know there is a problem, so we need to do something. And now, because you have different people from different areas having their own opinion, they will all offer you their own interpretation of what the solution must be, because we need to do something. This is the something. And I think whether you talk to consultants, whether you talk to investment bankers, they will all tell you a different thing. You need to do more M&A. You need to do more of this. You need to do more of that. But I think because the problem is so severe, it's very important we bring all the different opinions together, because it's not going to be any single one of these things that will solve it. It's going to be, at least in my mind, it's going to be a combination of all of them. It's really important we bring all these different ideas to the table together. because there is going to be in the future some kind of business model where it's not going to be just one thing changing. It's going to be a lot of things changing. And I think we need to figure out what is it and what is going to be the constellation of it. Are we going to stop doing research in-house, and are we going to leave it to the biotechs and then buy it out? Are we going to do more whatever crazy stuff are out there? But I think it's going to be all the different parts of the industry coming together, trying to figure it out. Not any single one of them pushing their own agenda.
And I think now we both come out of this episode as humble humans facing the challenges in the industry. That's also maybe a shout out to our listeners that we have our LinkedIn group, Cures and Capital podcast, where we would like to stimulate discussion. So if you sit and think I have something to contribute, please drop a comment or reach out to us in any other way. We'll very much appreciate that. But other than that, I don't think I have much more to add, unfortunately.
Me neither. So thank you very much for listening, and see you in the next episode.
Take care.